All right, let's try this again, but with my microphone on. So, I got a question from a student working on a Shiny app. They need outputs based on certain inputs, which is what a Shiny app does, but they need to take those outputs calculated from the input and then use them to make other outputs. I'm interpreting this question without seeing the code as basically being a question about using an intermediate step. So, let me pull up a helpful page here. So, in Shiny apps, in this article on reactivity, they introduced this idea of a reactive conductor, which is basically just a middle step. And for this to work, what we're going to do is instead of the usual, where, if you look at the default example when you say, give me a new Shiny app in RStudio, it has this thing where you can see your output is here. It's based on the inputs that you get from input $, and then whatever the name of the thing is based on what's in your UI function. Right? We're naming our inputs, we're naming our outputs, we're displaying them based on those names. And that's straightforward, right? We get an input, we make an output. If you've got that far, then you're fine, right? But for the intermediate steps, we have an extra step. So they give this example of if you're calculating Fibonacci numbers in a pretty inefficient way. You take the input and then you want to calculate two outputs. In this case, the Fibonacci number and then the inverse of the Fibonacci number, right? Its own reciprocal. So what do we do with that? Well, the simple way to write code is to just call Fibonacci twice, but that's going to be very inefficient. So we make an intermediate step. We save the Fibonacci result based on the inputs, and then we use that output for these two separate render text output values. Right? So we take the input, we calculate the Fibonacci number, we return the Fibonacci number and its inverse, but we aren't recalculating it twice at that point. So let me show you their code and then show you how I used their code in my example project just to demonstrate this concept. So they've got the Fibonacci function, which we've seen before, right? It's just a recursive call to itself if n is big. And then we calculate the current fib with reactive. So here's a slightly funny looking thing. We've got a function called reactive, and inside of it we have some code inside of curly braces. So here's where we're doing what we want to do to get our intermediate step. It's the result of calling to reactive, and then we save it into this variable name. Now where it gets extra weird is that that thing is a function. And so when we want the results, we need to call that function with the parentheses. So their outputs, instead of calculating Fibonacci and then calculating it again, they calculate it the one time in this reactive thing, and then they call that reactive thing twice. But when they call it, they don't have to recalculate it. It will recalculate when you give a different input, but at this point, it's not duplicating its effort. So let's take a look at my example. Let me clean up my R code as I go along. So I've got my input, right, in the UI object. It's called URLs. I've got my output in the UI. It's called ingredient table. In server, I'm going to see input $URLs. When I need to take my input, I'm taking it from there. And then I'm going to have an output $ingredient table gets assigned a data table output. So I do some stuff, and then I put it into output $ingredient table, and then we display that table on the UI. Right? So that's just, we take an input, we get an output. We pass the input from the UI into the server, we figure out the output on the server, and we pass it back to the UI. Right? Nice and easy. Now, here is my call to reactive, and actually, I've got to fix that. I need these curly braces. So what I've got here is a block of R code that I initially had just here. And I'm going to clean this up and put it back there as we go, but here it is in a reactive form. So I create this thing x. X is a terrible name, but this is just an example. It's x for example. It's the output of the reactive where I do this stuff. And part of what I'm doing is using a function that I imported at the beginning of my Shiny app. So my R code is easy to read here because it's hidden off in this other file. And then in this other file, you can sort of evaluate it in isolation. You can see it just sort of in terms of functionality, but here's where it's actually doing the heavy lifting, and it's getting passed into X. Now at this point, if I just call it like this, save and run, we're going to run into some problems. It's not going to do anything. Let me keep this up here for now. Give it a little bit of time just to prove that. But what I need to do is instead have X be a function call. Right? So when we look at what X is, actually, can we see that right now? If we look in the environment, is X saved in here? It's not. All right, that's fine. If we were to sort of go into this right now, what we would find is that X would show up under our functions, not under our values or our data. All right, so we've saved that. Let's refresh our app. And now it's going to take a little while because it is going back and getting the information. I'm going to make it go a little bit faster by cutting out a couple of these URLs. Now it only has to hopefully get those 3 URLs. And hopefully it actually also works. So what I started with, so in this case, I've got this intermediate value in X, and I could do something else with it also. But really, it's just taking the place of all this right here, which is what I really want. That's not what I want. So this parsing the input is just X, right? It's just the result of this intermediate value. But what this intermediate value is, in my case, I don't need it as a reactive. I just need the actual thing itself. So I can get rid of my call to X, get rid of that here. I don't need that comment there. Here, I'm just back to where I started with, take an input, get an output. But to do intermediate stuff with that, we just create an object that's the result of a call to reactive where your input is a block of R code. In my case, the R code that I'm actually using. In your case, it's the code that's calculating that intermediate step. And then with that, you can do stuff like output $, whatever your second thing is. It can be just that call to X, right? Or it could be, X, it could be we take X and we pass it into some other function, right? There's a lot of things we could do with that. But that's how we basically get an intermediate step, is with the reactive call. All right, hopefully that gets you on the right track. If not, ask in the usual places, and worst case, I will see you tomorrow.